Welcome to video 4 in the 5-part series here. This video will have a look at aged care and investing in Defence Force housing. Alright, let's move on to aged care. Now, in aged care, I'm not going to give the same sort of specifics that I have when it comes to registered rooming houses or NDIS housing, predominantly because aged care is going through a massive change. Now, as our population ages, this is certainly a high growth area, but already we might have an oversupply of aged care. So yeah, we need 40% more over the next 10 years, and yeah, we expect to spend 25 billion on it, but is it always the best investment? One needs to be very careful in it. There is some crossover with aged care and NDIS because of, well, the level of care and disabilities that we need to have. And you should also be aware that of the aged care providers, about 2/3 are not-profit and 1/3 are for-profit. This area is, like NDIS, highly complex, and there has recently been a Royal Commission into aged care, and some of the stories that are coming out are not great. Let me put it to you this way. Many operators lack human rights policies and honestly are breaching human rights. And so there is a fund called the Ethical Partners Fund Management Group, and they just altogether avoid investing in the aged care sector because of so much change. So what I'm trying to say here is there's a high risk of re-regulation. That is, if you bought into aged care now and the government looks at the Royal Commission and changes the rules and suddenly you're sitting on an investment that is no longer appropriate, that's not great. But it also means opportunity, because it means that when those new rules drop, then houses will have to be, new accommodation will have to be developed. So I think aged care is something that we should definitely watch, but I don't want to get into it too much because, well, there's a lot to it. I have a quick look at the Australian Defence Force housing. In fact, the exact authority is called Defence Housing Australia, or the DHA. These guys provide housing for our military personnel. A lot of people think of soldiers sleeping on barracks, but honestly, that's not the majority of housing for our Defence Force. But honestly, that's not the majority of housing for our Defence Force. The way it works is generally DHA will construct a property and then investors will buy that property off them and lease it back to the government. There is also a scheme where you can source your own house that is appropriate for DHS and then give it to them for approval. But in any case, the lease terms are roughly the same. The lease terms will be from 3 to 12 years, and they will be renewed, and they can be renewed at DHS's option. Generally, you'll find that the locations of where these houses they're kept quiet and perhaps even secret, and this makes a lot of sense. Certainly, you want to respect the privacy of soldiers and their families. I mean, this is national security after all. The great thing about the DHS is that it's guaranteed rent, and it's going to be paid in advance by the federal government. You are going to get paid. Now, you can buy DHS homes as a self-managed superannuation fund, as a foreign investor, provided that you are cleared by the Foreign Investment Review Board, and serving members of the Australian Defence Force can also buy into DHA housing. However, they can't have a house in the same place in which they are posted. So suppose that I bought a house next to Laverick Barracks in Townsville, and then I was posted in Townsville. That creates a problem. But for the most part, the investors that we're talking to in this audience aren't necessarily going to be members of the Australian Defence Force. Numbers vary a lot here. Now, we have facilities in the middle of Melbourne, so land would be very expensive, and we have them in the middle of nowhere. Australia is a big place, so land will be substantially cheaper. So I decided not to give any examples here because, well, it can be all over the shop. But generally, we should see these as a higher yield, not as high as NDIS, rather than growth assets. Property prices and rents are going to be fixed. You have no ability to negotiate with the government. In fact, once you're signed up, it's not a take it or leave it, it's just take it. The big downside here is the high management fee, which is a percentage of rent that's deducted from your monthly payments. Generally, there'll be 16.5% including GST for freestanding houses, but if you've got a house with body corporate, then it'll be 13%, and this really does eat into your returns. You can also buy ex-defence property. I've included a link below. Let's have a quick look at the pros and cons. Generally, the pros are, look, you're going to get reliable cash flow. It's the federal government that's paying you, and it's paid in advance, so you know. Most of your repairs are covered. Your rent will be paid even if the soldiers are sent overseas or if the place is unoccupied, so that's a relief. And also, annual revaluations are conducted by an independent licensed valuer, and that determines both the value of the house and also the rent. And I think the biggest pro here, apart from reliable cash flow, is the fact that this is completely painless. You know you're going to get paid. You know that things are going to work. You know you won't have bad tenants that you have to take to court. So if you've ever had a bad tenant, you've been fighting out in VCAT for several years, well, this might be kind of attractive. The cons are, of course, is that, yeah, management fee is high. That's why it's covering any of the repairs. You've got no negotiating power. The land is, well, once you're in, you're restricted, and it's really, really hard to try and sell it mid-lease. Also, you're kind of restricted in sort of the property choices because, hey, you're buying houses next to military bases so our servicemen can go to work every day. Also, be aware that the landlord will pay for rates, water, that's reimbursed, body corporate, land tax, some insurance, all the regular stuff, and any structural repairs that occur. Okay, so let's move on to Enraz. Now, in fact, Enraz, the National Rent Affordability Scheme, is dead, and unfortunately it's no longer open to new investors. So, Phil, why the hell are you telling me about this scheme that I can't get into? And I think it boils down to this question as to what's next for Australia's housing affordability. You see, this system was operating for 10 years, and dwellings that were constructed up to the 30th of June in 2016, well, they can still continue in this program, and it will operate for another 10 years, and that'll be it. The program will then cease to exist. And then what? What happens to all of these renters who are receiving below market rate rent? And these are people who need help in society. At the moment, the federal government has literally no answer. But we'll get to that in a second. I think the important thing is this scheme existed. We don't have a replacement. And so the federal government will come up with something. It'd be good to know what existed previously, because the new scheme, if and when that comes out, may resemble some aspects of Enraz, and it's helpful to understand how it used to work, or in fact does still work if you were lucky enough to own one of these houses. In the current year, it is the house has to be offered to an eligible tenant who has a low taxable income of less than $52,000 here, and the landlord would rent out the dwelling for less than 80% of market rate. The landlord then picks up a refundable tax offset, and that's pretty special because most tax offsets are not refundable, with the exception of franking credits, to the tune of like $11,000 a year, right? So how does this work? Let's have a look at an example. This is just a house that I found on the internet, renting out for $330 a week in Hoppers Crossing in Victoria. You take that 330, multiply it by 0.2, multiply by 52 weeks a year, and you end up with $3,400 worth of discounted rent that you don't pick up as a landlord. But you get your $11,000 in refundable tax offsets, that's as good as cash, which leads you to $7,800 better off. Okay, so this is a great scheme. I actually know people who receive a substantial cash refund from the government despite their decent income. The Enraz scheme is more than enough to wipe out their entire tax bill. So like I said, it's past. I can't get into it now if I bought a new house. So what? Well, like I said, we don't have an answer, or the federal government doesn't have an answer. New Zealand got rid of negative gearing, but that could create problems with debt repayability because it's worse for the economy to have falling house prices. And Labor also had this policy for the past 2 elections and has recently ditched it. Now, we actually currently have almost 33,000 properties who are existing in this scheme, and they will exit over the next 10 years. So you can see this red line that's decreasing here over 10 years. And the number of allocations that are ceasing per year in the blue here, right? That's a lot of low-income people who will be struggling. If they stay in the same dwelling, their house, their rental costs will go up by 20% overnight, or they're going to have to get up and move, and not to a place that's cheaper, right? Which that too incurs unnecessary costs. So, you know, I expect that the Enraz will be replaced at some stage, and so a smart investor would keep an eye out for new government initiatives in this area. Well, you made it to the end of the video, and if you got this far, it'd be really great if you could give this video a like. It really does help the algorithm know that this is helpful to investors. And if you hit subscribe, well, you can learn more, because I'm going to have part 5 released very, very soon. Remember, of course, all the links will be in the description, including the link to the next video. There is also a playlist and probably a card left to write it. I can't remember until I get into the editing suite. Okay, happy investing.